Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the life, the times, and the works of Cedric Robinson. Born in Oakland, California in 1940, Cedric Robinson would become a leading political theorist and teacher of the Black radical tradition. His monumental book, Black Marxism, critiqued Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels for ignoring racism in the development of capitalism. He argued that Marx and Engels were wrong to see capitalism as a revolutionary departure from feudalism, but instead said capitalism emerged itself from the feudal order and kept its feudal base through slavery and racism. It's what he called racial capitalism. Cedric Robinson died in 2016 at the age of 75. My guest for this conversation is Joshua Meyers. Joshua Meyers is an associate professor of Africana Studies in the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University, and he is the author of the book, Cedric Robinson, The Time of the Black Radical Tradition. He joins me over Zoom. Joshua Meyers, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
Thanks, Mitch. Thanks for having me.
Looking forward to this conversation. Let me just have you fact check what I said there in the introduction, because I wanted to dive immediately into some of his bigger ideas, especially around Marxism. Was I in the ballpark? Was I correct in how I described what his critiques of both Marx and Engels, and also what he referred to as racial capitalism?
Certainly, I think it was a critique that comes out of a sensibility that was in large measure in solidarity with Marxist struggle. I think that part gets left out a lot. It wasn't a critique about negating everything that particular radical tradition was able to develop, especially throughout the 20th century. But it was saying that there were certain things that Marxist analysis didn't necessarily cover fully. And one of those things was the question and problematic of race as something that went much deeper than an antagonism to separate the working classes, that it went into the soils of Western civilization. And that to the extent that we don't understand that and at its root, we end up replicating the forms in which that racial categorization took place, not only in terms of how you designate a working class, but also its implications for national identity. That's something that Robinson was also very much keen on pointing out. And so he takes that analysis and he goes far beyond what he does in the book Black Marxism. He takes that analysis and he looks at the ways in which capitalism and the entertainment industry converge to produce these racial categories, to produce racial markers of identity. And so his last book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, which looks at the film and theater industry, is really an extension of his thoughts on the convergence between race and capital, and how capital utilizes race, how it's functional, how race is functional for capital. And there's also, of course, the book that came out a few years before that comes out of his teaching Marxian philosophy and Marxist politics and Marxist struggle, a book called An Anthropology of Marxism, where he actually roots the struggle of socialism in Western thought as coming before the creation of the Communist Manifesto in the 19th century, but actually in the struggles against the church, in the struggles of peasant revolts and women who were heretics, and all of these different forms of identity that are, of course, grafted onto peoples because of their material conditions, but they make sense of those material conditions with much more than just a philosophical analysis of materialism. They actually use questions of religion, questions of the ideal, in order to inform their struggle. And so those are the things that Cedric Robinson was interested in, I think, in large measure, because his activist history, his struggles in the 1960s, I think there was a sense that there was something missing about how we understand, in particular, the ways Black communities faced down the behemoth of white supremacy and racial capitalism. And so, by the way, that term racial capitalism was basically a shorthand for understanding the civilizational groundings of race in the West, and how that could only necessarily merge with capitalism. So I think your definition of it in the introduction is spot on.
So not necessarily a hostile critique towards
Right.
Marxism. Would he have identified himself as a Marxist?
Probably not. I've never seen that in writing. He, of course, there are several times in writing where he identified as a socialist. Some of his students, including Dara Thomas, was somewhat insistent that he was an anarchist. But I think for Robinson, the most clearest sort of association ideologically would be his term, the Black radical tradition. And so when you look at the first few pages of Black Marxism, where he talks about a people's struggle, the preface first, our people's struggle, and then he talks about in the introduction, these two radical traditions, right? The Marxian tradition and the Black radical tradition. I think it would be safe to associate him with the Black radical tradition that he tries to understand, and that connected him to his grandfather, that connected him to his enslaved ancestors, that connected him to Africa, because ultimately what the Black radical tradition in his understanding were the sort of authentic ways that enslaved Africans, colonized Africans, sought to recreate their lives in the face of capitalism, in the face of slavery, in the face of imperialism. So those ways, of course, become the grounds for 20th century Black philosophers and Black political thinkers, but they preceded them, right? They preceded Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois. They preceded C.L.R. James. And so he identifies that, and he sees that. He sees that in his own family. He identifies his own sort of grounding in both faith traditions, in traditions of family and community, as also a reservoir for struggling against systems of inequality, systems of power in particular. And so, it's hard to put a label on that, right? Because in the 20th century, theorists emerge and they try to situate all these different moving parts and say, well, that must be socialism, or that is communalism, or that is, all of these different identities. What Cedric Robinson was saying, yeah, it's all of those. And it's also Black people trying to live again, trying to recreate their life. And so if you were to ask me what he identified, I would say within the Black radical tradition, but that can have many different forms. And I think we should do our work to excavate all the different forms that took, which is really what Cedric Robinson's major works were about.
The radical Black tradition, this was outside of academia. And in fact, he would even write about the tension that Black radical scholars would have being within the academic system itself.
Right. Oh, sure. Going back to his first engagement with, the Western Academy, University of California at Berkeley, 1958. He was searching, and wasn't him alone. It was a group of young Black scholars, students, less than 100 probably, in 1958, when Berkeley's a huge campus, as you know, and as your listeners are aware of. But Berkeley integrated a long time before 1958. There were Black students, in other words, a long time before 1958, but still by 1958, they were still in the hundreds, if that. And that group was very close-knit. They had to be. And one of the reasons they were close-knit was not just the microaggressions that they would face, but also they didn't find themselves in the curriculum at all. They didn't find things that made sense to them in the curriculum at all. And so Robinson talks about how they would have to have school beyond the school and in the libraries and in those coffee houses and search for these out-of-print books about Black life. Even the library didn't have everything that they needed. So they would do these searches and they would find the books and they would then study the books, and then they would have a way to confront the absences that were based in the curriculum. And by the way, there were only 2 Black faculty too. So from 1958 until he graduates in 1963, there's a sea change in terms of Black activism and Black presence on campus. And of course, by the time you get to the end of the decade with the Black studies struggle, there's a wholly different transformation. There's a wholly different, it's a wholly different space because of that transformation. It's not just the free speech movement. In fact, Robinson and others were involved, at least in the outskirts of the free speech movement, because they wanted to bring Malcolm X to campus. But it's also anti-communist hysteria. It's also pro-Cuba activism. It's also pro-South African activism. It's also anti-death penalty activism, right? All of those things precede free speech and are energized by free speech, but they're also energized by Black radicalism too. And to me, that's the story you should be telling about the student movement. We have to go back to the so-called silent generation, as some people have argued, of the late 1950s, early 60s, and look at what's happening there to understand free speech, and also look at it through a Black lens to really fully get everything that's happening. Because without the Malcolm X controversy, we don't know whether or not there's a free speech question. Certainly Frank Wilkinson and his engagement with that, but there's also Malcolm X. So by the time Robinson gets his PhD, there's more Black people in the academy, but he's still struggling with the absences of the curriculum, and in particular, political theory, which is a discipline that's trying to discipline political behavior, essentially. I mean, that word is not an accident. And so they're trying to make sense of how political behaviors can be managed in a system that must support the status quo, because there's no political theory that's about undermining American democracy, right? All political theory is about supporting American democracy. I think we see that, of course, in terms of political theory's relationship to internationalism, right? It's about exporting the idea of American democracy, especially in the Cold War context. So what does that look like for a Black scholar coming out of the movement? It looks like we have to break out too. We have to figure out a way, because this is not going to work for us. Especially when you look at the Black Power era. And so that moment causes him to begin to struggle with his professors. And it was only in Black studies where he could find a hospitable place to have this orientation, this intellectual orientation. He would later, of course, hold positions in political science. And even then, there's that, do you really belong to this? And I don't think he had a problem with saying, no, I don't belong and I don't want to belong. I want to belong to Black studies because political science belongs to the American project, right? And to a non-progressive American project at that. So his orientation has always been within the academy, because there are students in the academy and there are people who want to struggle within the academy, but also having another foot outside of the academy in whatever communities he found himself in, whether that was in upstate New York, in England, or finally in Santa Barbara, where he spent the most of his life after his PhD.
He got his PhD in 1974 at Stanford University. He would have to go to court in order to force the university to give him his PhD. What was his PhD thesis, and why was it so difficult to get it?
It was like I was saying earlier, it was a challenge to political theory. And the challenge was based on the idea of power and leadership. So political theory basically has this notion that leadership is not only logical, it's necessary, that any human society must have leaders, and that leaders are what help human societies flourish. This is the basic concept of political theory. Cedric says, well, that's basically a myth. And by calling it a myth, what it ultimately did is it rendered his dissertation committee completely unable to provide any effective direction, because for them, the myth was not only a reality, it was the grounding for how to do political theory. So the reason that Robinson says, look, this is a myth, is ultimately his understanding of leadership was that it was a corruption of what made human beings ultimately feel free, have liberation. In other words, he uses the concept charisma, which is this ultimate feeling of having some sense of salvation or deliverance or grace. The idea, it's hard to express this because charisma has been taken so far out of context. But charisma is this notion that through human and religious experience, that we can actually create a sense of almost ecstasy on earth. And that ecstasy is what creates, that ecstatic experience is what creates the possibility for a beloved kind of community, a community that is together and can flourish as a community. Political leadership corrupts that. And so now we conflate that feeling with the ability to select a leader, which ultimately is relinquishing our power to have that feeling encompassed out of our own experiences. It allows the leadership to dictate what that experience is now. And so we have charismatic leadership. Robinson says that's a corruption of the concept of charisma. But why does the leader need to corrupt this? In order to manage the populations who would have that ecstatic experience. And leadership becomes a form of control, authority, becomes a way to establish that control. And ultimately the word that he uses is order, which gets into how peoples have accepted that the naturalness of leadership and authority. Think about how we use the word order, the corruption of the social order, or to restore order. What does that mean? It means to restore power in its right place. And so the elimination or the reduction of chaos becomes the project of the political theorist. Now, in saying all of that, Robinson has stepped outside of the norm, so far out of the norm that the political theorists on his committee, well, there's only one true political theorist. The other folks are political scientists, meaning they don't even think about the theory part of it. They just think about how to, take observations and make sense out of observations, often quantitatively, right? So it's so far outside of the bounds that they inherently reject it. So ultimately, they have to get a committee that, one, was willing to read it, and then secondly, was willing to allow Robinson to have such, it's really a heretical position and still be awarded a degree. The kicker is this. The kicker is Stanford at the time was recruiting Black students because of what happened in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination. There's a student movement at Stanford. They wanted more Black students, especially Black students from the area, East Palo Alto. And that's a huge controversial point. And so they bring in these graduate students to sort of diversify. And Robinson says, look, I'm coming. But he issues a warning and says, I'm going to challenge political theory. I'm coming to challenge political theory. Had they listened to him in 1968 when he said this, there would have been no controversy. But I guess they didn't take this idea seriously. So by the time he was ready to defend his dissertation, we can't deal with this. So he takes a position at the University of Michigan in 1971, I think. And the whole time, he doesn't have his PhD. It becomes a problem for him at University of Michigan. He moves to Binghamton in 1974. He still doesn't have his PhD in hand. And so he's struggling and going back and forth because ultimately it's both a question of academic bureaucracy, but it is also an intellectual question too. And so I didn't look at any of the court documents. I don't know if they actually went all the way. I think it was more of a threat. So that ultimately is what pushes Stanford to select a younger assistant professor. And forgive me if I mispronounce her name, but the former president of Duke University, in fact, Nanera Kahan, she was the only person to fill out his committee, along with his advisor, Charles Dreckmeyer and Richard Brody, to finally get his PhD awarded in the mid 1970s.
This is letters.
Convoluted.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation about the life, the times, and the works of Cedric Robinson. Our guest is Joshua Meyers, who's Associate Professor of Africana Studies at the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University. He is the author of the book, Cedric Robinson, the time of the Black radical tradition. His previous book was called We Are Worth Fighting For, A History of the Howard University Student Protest of 1989. The biographical sketch, and I say sketch, that might not give it justice. The biography that you give on Cedric Robinson in your book is very fascinating to me for a few reasons. One, it sort of begins, I say sort of, but we'll clarify, in Oakland, and that's where I'm broadcasting from, and you actually really get into the first half of the 20th century history of Oakland, which is important. And he's born in Oakland in 1940, but his grandfather, who is a very important influence, who I'd like to talk about, Winston Cap Whiteside, comes to Oakland from Alabama in the late 1920s. That piqued my interest because usually the story of Oakland and its the Black community in Oakland usually seems to begin more around the 1940s with World War II, in which you have many people come from the South to California during this period of time. Oakland is one of the destinations where a lot of shipbuilding jobs are at. But the fact that his father came in the his grandfather came in the late 1920s is really interesting to me. Tell me about Winston Cap Whiteside, his grandfather.
Wow. So I guess I have to tell the story of why he came. So Winston Cap Whiteside is the son of people who were enslaved. Roots in the South, Virginia. There's some Virginia roots from his parents. And they end up migrating, I think Virginia and North Carolina, and they end up migrating to Alabama. Mobile, Alabama was a place that had prospects for newly emancipated enslaved people, but it wasn't necessarily always good there. There was a lot of racialized violence during Reconstruction during that period. And so one of the things I wanted to do is paint a picture of that so that we understand that when Winston Whiteside in the 1920s decided to leave, it was under the pale of the possibility of his own lynching. And the reason that he was possibly threatened with the lynching is because of his decision to seek revenge on the boss of his wife, a hotel manager at the famous Battle House Hotel in Mobile, Alabama, who had decided, as Robinson writes, to quote, exercise his sexual privileges on his wife, Clara. So after that happened, Winston went down to the hotel and he beat up the manager, left him for dead, in fact. The manager survived, but it was clear that he had to leave. And Robinson says that he never mistreated any of his, according to legend, he never mistreated any of his employees again after that. So there's another history of how Black people defended themselves against sexual violence in Alabama, which we now know more about through the life of Rosa Parks. So there's another conversation to be had there. But he of course decides to go to Oakland. Oakland at the time had a Black population. It was a large enough Black population to have an active NAACP. There was, of course, also an active chapter of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, Garvey's organization in Oakland. I think Garvey may have even visited, if I'm not mistaken, during this era. There, of course, is questions of labor. Most Black people were Pullman porters. Black men were Pullman porters in Oakland because of the railroad system. Oakland is a major entrepot of the railroad system. And that's why many of these migrants before the Great Migration era were attracted to Oakland. There are even students at Berkeley, Black students at Berkeley during this time, including Louise Thompson Patterson, the future member of the Communist Party, a critical member, along with her husband, William Patterson, of the Communist Party, which also gets me to saying there were Black radicals, Black communists in Oakland at the time. So there's a lot to be said about pre-migration Black Oakland. And that's the world that Winston Whiteside inhabits. There's another curious story when he gets there around 1933, I think it was. This is in the book, but he encounters someone trying to rob his friend's store. He's in the store with his friend. This is in West Oakland somewhere, and he saw very very early on that the brother had a toy gun, and so he bided his time, and then he chased him all the way down the street and made a citizen's arrest. And so he was that was the kind of person Winston Whiteside was. He had a sense of justice. He had a sense of fairness. He had a sense of truth and right. He was also somewhat diminutive. He was 5'4", but he was larger than life in many respects. And he raised, as soon as he got to Oakland, about a year after, he brought his family, his wife and 3 daughters, and they had a very important religious practice. They are converted to the Seventh-day Adventists, which I am told was a major thing among Black Oaklanders, particularly Black Oaklanders who were high achieving academically because they emphasized study in the Seventh-day Adventist tradition. But he was also very much a patriarch in the sense of cultivating a loving family and trying to support that family. But they all worked. Because they had a janitorial service in the city, and I believe they got a contract with City Hall, which was a major thing. It doesn't translate into a lot of wealth, but it does translate into steady work for the family, and that's kind of where Robinson's working class sensibility comes from. He would work as a janitor all the way up until while he was at Berkeley, while he was a student at Berkeley, he would help out working as a janitor at City Hall. But it was his grandfather's will to create some sense of security for the family that was very much a major influence, really, on Robinson's character. He says his intellectual influence, but it's also an influence on his character.
This is also a time in Oakland where we have such figures as C.L. Dellums, a labor organizer. People will recognize the name, especially where we're broadcasting out of, Dellums, from Ron Dellums, former congressional member and mayor of Oakland. This is his uncle. Tell me about, and in fact, you go down to Amtrak today, and right outside of the building is a statue of C.L. Dellums. Tell me about C.L. Dellums.
C.L. Dellums was a major figure. He was a major figure within the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And ultimately, the unionization efforts of the Pullman Porters was energized by the organization of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Chambermaids in 1925 under the leadership of A. Philip Randolph from Florida, but who was based in New York. For those who may not know, the Pullman Porters were overworked. It was a good job, but it was a job where they had unfair working conditions. They were always on call, which is why if you look at the area of West Oakland where the Black community was congregated, it was a stone's throw away from where the rail station was, because they were always on call. They ultimately were underpaid. There was a system. I'm not an expert on the Pullman Porters, but there was a system whereby they had to log their hours, but it was unfair. So there was a lot of undercounting of what the actual work was. There, of course, were the psychological elements. For those who may not know, the Pullman cars are like hotels on the train, and so they were expected, to be to genuflect among these elites who used the train. They were called boy, or they were called George, I should say, which is basically the same thing as being called boy. But George was the owner. George Pullman, I think. George Pullman, yeah, was the owner. So they were all called George. All these Black men who were the porters. And so there was that part of it too. And so while it was considered to be a safe job, in terms of economic status, it was also a lot of there were poor working conditions. So Pullman porters had status within the community of West Oakland because they were organized. Black Oakland was a community of organization. I talked about the churches, NAACP and UNIA, but if you didn't belong to any civic or fraternal organization, it was almost like you weren't there. And so when the porters came, the porters combined the civic, social, but also the political and economic activism. And it was a very, very important element. And C.L. Dellums ends up becoming a central part of that because he was based in Oakland, and he was also had national stature within the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters. And that was really important to the community. And they would then translate that work into a lot of work around anti-discrimination. The key system was a major source of non-Pullman porters being employed by the city, but they did not have equal access to those jobs. And so throughout the second part of the 20th century, it was about opening the door to civil service. People like Taria Hall Pittman, another figure involved in that work, another Berkeley graduate from the early years, gets involved in that kind of work. And Robinson's mother spends 40-something years working in the state employment office. And so there's that part too. So I wish I could say more about C.L. Dellums, but he was a major figure in terms of the cohesion of the Black working class community in West Oakland, certainly before the World War II migrations, and definitely that foundation that they established allowed for there to be pre-existing institutions by the time those migrants sort of explode on the scene during that period. So in that sense, he was a critical person.
It seemed to me, in preparing for our conversation, that Cedric Robinson would precede many of the movements that would follow. He'd still be around for the movements. He didn't die until 2016, but was in Oakland, active in Oakland, before the Black Power movement, before the rise of the Black Panther Party. We were talking about the ethnic studies movement. Seems like he was involved in that, maybe setting the groundwork. You'll better clarify for such a movement to come. It just seemed to me when I was preparing for our conversation, going through the life of Cedric Robinson, he was always preceding what was to come. Yeah,
I mean, you're right. So it's interesting. I came out to Oakland to do a little bit of research on this period. And most people that I talked to, I didn't do a lot of formal interviewing, but I did do a few conversations with people who were sort of the archivists around the city. So most people that I talked to, they thought I was coming to talk about 1968, 1966 and beyond, right? Because that's the foundation of the Black Panther Party. October 15, 1966, which you actually unpack it. It's not that simple. But the memory of Black power is now being stretched back. And a half decade before you have the Panthers, you have Black power formations in Oakland. And Robinson was in the thick of that. And so to tell part of the story, because I can't tell all of it. In 1961, there is the student chapter of the NAACP at Berkeley. And they are into Black power, even as it's not being articulated as such. And it's large, and it's in large measure because they're thinking about Cuba and South Africa. And so you have to think about the Pan-Africanist Congress, for instance, in South Africa. You have to think about the Cuban Revolution. Who was able to bring those discourses together and bring it to Black America? None other than Robert F. Williams from North Carolina, who was a leader in the NAACP, but who believed in militant self-defense. Robert F. Williams also spends time in Cuba and China after he's ultimately forced into exile because he was a dangerous element. The United States government felt that, what do you do with dangerous elements? You indict them. But before he gets there, he spends time at Berkeley. And Robinson meets him, and he, of course, engages him on these particular questions. And it makes a lot of sense to him. Why? Because of his family and his community. We would do the same things. If the Klan was coming to West Oakland, we would probably arm ourselves, right? It makes a lot of sense. But it was also grounded in revolutionary struggle and revolutionary theory. And that's why Cuba was such a critical part of this. Because Cuba is translating that sense of community and self-determination and self-defense into a program of socialism, right? So transformation is the key. And the South African example is important because it sort of embodies what it looks like for a settler colonial system to prevent that self-determination from emanating. So when Williams gets brought up on charges, Robinson creates the Bay Area Committee to defend the Monroe defendants. And he has rallies in the Bay Area support of the Monroe defendants. And I think that is in large measure a precursor to some of the stuff that we would see in 1966. And that's not even to mention the Afro-American Association, which comes out of this. That's not even to mention the West Coast chapter of the Revolutionary Action Movement, which precedes the Panthers. And it's not even to mention the Black Panther Party of Northern California, which precedes this too. In fact, Robinson spends several months in Mexico with Kenny Freeman, a very critical figure in the history of Bay Area radicalism, who's the founder of the Black Panther Party of Northern California, which comes out of the SNCC tradition. I have my SNCC sweater on. The SNCC tradition of organizing in Lowndes County. And so you have a Black Panther Party of New York, you have a Black Panther Party of Los Angeles, and you have a Black Panther Party of North Carolina between 1964 and 65. And Robinson is actually close to the founder of the Northern California chapter. So all of this precedes when most people seem to start Black Power in 1966. And so you're right about that. And you're also right about the Black Studies part. He was doing Black Studies before Black Studies was actually formally organized and institutionalized in the academy, which is also a Black Panther Party story. If you want, we can get into that, but it's very, very much integrated.
I just want to follow up on Robert F. Williams. This sounds important. Is the aftermath of what would happen to him being going into exile? Is this when some would accuse the NAACP of sort of losing its international outlook and just focusing more domestically?
It was already lost by then. That narrative probably would have been the early part of the Cold War, 1949, 1950, which is very interesting, right? Because the NAACP is very centered around its headquarters and its bureaucracy in New York. But you have local chapters that are doing what is necessary. Rosa Parks' local chapter is doing what is necessary. Septima Poinsett Clark's local chapters is doing whatever is necessary. And Ella Baker is someone who recognizes that. And she's very close to these local, as an organizer within the NAACP, she's very close to the local communities that are using the NAACP as a vehicle for whatever they need. And what they needed mostly was the erosion and the radical transformation of society, which means the elimination of Jim Crow and the creation of self-determination. And that's what Robert F. Williams was about. And the natural connection that this has to anti-colonialism was, of course, apparent to people like W.E.B. Du Bois in the late 1940s in his second stint at the NAACP. But it was also apparent that American empire did not need Black organizations like the NAACP to make such connections. And so they showed Du Bois the door in 1948. And so it happens much earlier in many respects. Robert F. Williams was basically continuing a tradition in spite of what the national NAACP believed was necessary. And so yeah, it happened before, but it didn't stop people like Williams. By the way, when Williams comes back to the States, he moves to Detroit, another important important city, and Robinson is teaching at Ann Arbor, and so he would have Williams give lectures to his students. So here's a real living revolutionary example, and not to exclude Mabel Williams, his wife.
In talking about Cedric Robinson preceding what would come afterwards, I think we could very much, again, look back at his book he's best remembered for, but he wrote a number of books. But the book he's best remembered for is Black Marxism and ideas around racial capitalism. And in some ways, with that, he was kind of preceding what we'd see within this last decade. I think of the rise of Black Lives Matter, talking about racial capitalism, and even kind of the debate that we saw really in 2016 on the left over the candidacy of Bernie Sanders and race. There was a moment there was some real tension about, is it about class or is it about race?
Yeah.
I mean, we could, more than 30 years before, in 1983, we get his book, Black Marxism.
Well, it comes out of the fact that Black radicals have been struggling over that question 50 years before that. And so Robinson has to master that discourse and that conversation. And it's probably even, we can go back to Hubert Henry Harrison, really, and his break with the Socialists Party of America. That's the 19 teens. And so part of the recovery project that he initiates as a student at Berkeley is, we ain't the first to think about this stuff. We couldn't have been. And then the second part of it is, after we recover the intellectuals, we got to recover the people. So part of his ability to resituate, or part of the reason that his work can help us resituate some of what happened in recent years, is that he recovers the ways that this was understood in moments of similar upheaval. The Reconstruction era, right? Is it class or race? I mean, you can ask these same questions, right? The Great Depression, is it class? Is it race? Right? And then you get to the 1970s, when some people say Black power declines, or the Black power movement declines. It actually doesn't really decline. It broadens to include the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist conversation as it was being debated in Africa, in the Caribbean, and Latin America. Scholars have just now really caught up with that fact. People in the movement always knew that it was there. And so you see Robinson engaging younger radicals like Amilcar Cabral from Guinea-Bissau, because that's what's happening now. Black Marxism comes out of the 1970s, even as it's interrogating earlier moments of this question. You have to understand Walter Rodney, C.L.R. James, Sylvia Wynter, what we called the third world radicalism, in order to really understand the context through which Black Marxism, racial, and ideas of racial capitalism in the Black radical tradition sort of emerged. And so that's one of the things that I tried to write about, is this period, this moment in the 1970s, despite the fact that we've been told that, well, that's when the movement declined, it actually became an intense ideological and philosophical debate around race, class, nation, identity, all of the things that people are struggling around today. And so if people want to study the precursors to this particular moment, that's where I would start them, right? The left was having the same debate in the 1970s. And the only difference I see, and this may not be fair all the time, is that it was global and internationalist in scope.
In the 70s.
In the 70s.
I want to really try to see if I can wrap my head around the idea of the connection between capitalism and feudalism. Cedric Robinson really went deep into European history and telling this story. And am I correct in understanding he went as deep as sort of, ancient, almost ancient history with the Germanic invasions from the north into Europe?
The decline of the Roman Empire.
Yeah. And the invasion of these people, and then what they did in creating a feudal system is that these Germanic folks from basically Scandinavian countries created their own kingdoms and created feudalism, and the serfs, the ones who were at the bottom of all this, were the non-Germanic people.
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, I would say. I think it's not just the Germanic and the Scandinavians. It's all of what we would now call Western Europe. The Scandinavian invasions, happened several hundred years after this system was being developed. Because when you see the Norsemen invade, they're invading a Catholic sort of, really a theocracy in many respects. I mean, it's a society organized around the church. But the invasions that their ancestors made was an invasion against empire, right? And so one of the things that they retained from the Roman Empire is the centrality of the church. And so Robinson says this is the Christian world. This is Christendom. And Christendom has this inherent binary system of identifying individuals, right? Either you are Christian or you're heathen. It's very simple, or pagan. And there just happens to be a lot of categories of pagan, right? And over time, what you begin to see is that category of pagan become less and less grafted on towards people that look like what we think a European looks like, right? Over time, that religious designation becomes a phenotypical and racialized designation. It doesn't happen automatically. This happens over centuries. In some cases, it's still happening if you look at Western Europe's relationship to Eastern Europe. Sometimes Eastern Europeans don't get to be quote unquote Europeans or white, right? Sometimes they're just othered. And that has a lot to do with this particular process around Christendom. And so what Robinson ultimately is showing is that the economic system is underpinned by this system of identity and identification. And once you start putting questions of war, the Crusades, the rebellions, territorial conquests, questions of labor, who gets to be enslaved, right? Who gets to be a serf, who gets to be a noble, and then nation, who gets to be in power, all of that combines to create the racialized problems that we have. And Africans are introduced to this system almost 1,000 years after it had been developed within the context of Christendom. And even when Africans were first introduced to it through the Portuguese, there was still this possibility that through salvation, they could become part of the in as opposed to the out. That only changes once the Portuguese decide that it is more lucrative to use enslaved African people as the source of labor. And by 1492, when the quote unquote New World is inhabited by the Spanish, there's now a huge market for this. And so the transition from a kind of Christian orientation to a secular, rational system of identifying and categorizing human beings has everything to do with the identification of the landmass that we call America as a space for the exploitation of labor. There would have been no reason to transition in the way that it did, absent the development of the capitalist development of the New World. And so Robinson is saying that, but another scholar who he interacted with, Sylvia Winter, a Jamaican scholar, is also saying that. And so that's how they understood the development of race. It wasn't just, post 1619 or post, it was actually in the 15th century we begin to see this transition out of the feudal order into the newer capitalist order.
But still very much in the feudal tradition. Now it's
yeah.
And it was a challenge because when it was based on a religious identity, you had many Africans at the time converting to Christianity. So, I mean, this is what I've heard before. So now you needed a different reason to continue to enslave somebody once they converted to Christianity.
Well, yeah, I think part of it is also, that's certainly true. It's also part, and you know, when the Spanish get over here, they were doing the same thing the Portuguese were doing. So you're right about that. But it's also the fact that the difference between feudal and one of the main differences between feudal exploitation and capitalist exploitation is that under capitalism, you don't have to be an aristocrat anymore to benefit. So there's a rags to riches part of this too. And so you can sort of emerge as a former merchant or a former laborer and become a small capitalist, as opposed to being a large scale capitalist, which is why question of private property and land and the American idea of Horatio Alger and all of these things emerge too, which also means we have to have a strict separation between who can become a capitalist and who can never become a capitalist. And that's why identity becomes critical to the maintenance of this project. Because if we say that, you know, there's a route, there's a path out of this for, you know, the indigenous or for the enslaved African, then we have no way of controlling that population and making sure that we can continue to exploit them. And so whiteness becomes a category of peoples who can benefit from the system. I mean, Gerald Horne calls it free trade in Africans. Anybody who had a little bit of money could invest in the slave trade, right? And the logic of settler colonialism is, look, I'm poor in England or I'm poor in Europe. Let me just go over there and figure out how to make a living. I mean, the idea of the American liberal democratic project is based on this notion that everybody can have access to this dream. But there's the exception. The exception is race. And so you're right. It evolves into what we have now out of those particular earlier conditions.
And that's the legacy of feudalism.
Yes. Yes.
Joshua Meyers has been our guest. Again, Joshua Meyers has joined us for a conversation on the life, the works, and the times of Cedric Robinson. Joshua Meyers is an associate professor of Africana Studies in the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University, and he is the author of the book, Cedric Robinson, The Time of the Black Radical Tradition. Joshua Meyers, I enjoyed that very much. I found it very informational, and I thank you dearly for taking this time to join me today.
Oh, you're welcome. Very welcome. Thank you for having me.